The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here. It's great to see so many friends and familiar faces who are champions in the fight in combating human trafficking. Our hearing today will focus on the preparations for the upcoming Super Bowl to prevent human trafficking and strategies employed by airlines, buses, and trains, as well as hotels, designed to mitigate human trafficking. In less than a week, New Jersey will be hosting the Super Bowl, and along with welcoming enthusiastic fans, the state also is preparing for the likely influx of both domestic and international traffickers. As a matter of fact, many of them are already there. Sadly, but almost certainly, they are bringing with them sexually exploited trafficking victims, many of them from abroad, in an attempt to cash in on the Super Bowl crowds. We know from the past, any sports venue, and especially the Super Bowl, acts as a sex trafficking magnet. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, for example, reports that more than 10,000 exploited women and girls were trafficked to Miami for the Super Bowl in 2010. This must not happen again. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has put in place a robust anti-human trafficking plan. For example, his Department of Homeland Security and Preparedness has stepped up efforts to combat trafficking at the Super Bowl, distributing flyers to emergency medical services, fire department, law enforcement, and other emergency care professions so that these frontline professionals will know when to be concerned that someone is a trafficking victim and how to respond appropriately. The transportation and hospitality training concept has proven straightforward, effective, and thankfully it is catching on. On our way to yet another Assembly and Community Awareness Conference, this time at St. Elizabeth's College in Morristown, New Jersey Assistant Attorney General Tracy Thompson, who is spearheading the Christie administration's anti-human trafficking effort, told me earlier today that they have trained 10,000 people, including the Train the Trainer initiative. She noted that the Super Bowl creates an increased, quote, breeding ground for sex trafficking. She also said today's victims can be any race, age, or gender. Victims are exploited for prostitution, pornography, and forced labor. She went on to say traffickers control victims through force and fraud, utilizing physical and psychological abuse, threats, and isolation. Know it, see it, report it, she continued. According to Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott, the Super Bowl can be described as he puts it, and I quote him, the single largest human trafficking incident in the United States. Captain Doug Kane, Louisiana State Police spokesman, said after the 2013 Super Bowl in New Orleans, quote, anytime you have a large influx of tourists in town and they're spending a lot of money, there's a criminal element that moves in to take advantage of that, close quote. Greece, which hosted the Olympics in 2004, saw a 95% increase in trafficking victims in the months leading up to and including the Olympics. Next month, Russia, a country ranked as at the lowest tier, what we call Tier 3, by the annual U.S. Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report, as we all know, will host the Olympic Games. Since Russia does not have in place any formal national procedures to guide law enforcement in the identification of sex trafficking victims and does not fund trafficking victim care, I and so many others are very concerned that the 2014 Winter Olympics may turn out to be a trafficking nightmare. Later this year, Brazil will host the 2004 World Cup and then the 2016 Summer Olympics. Although Brazil has improved their anti-trafficking laws, and I've actually been there, I've met with lawmakers in Brasilia, and is taking steps to mitigate trafficking risks, the fact remains that Brazil will have to do much more if they want to protect their children from sex tourism. Numbers from Brazil's federal police indicate that between 250,000 to 400,000 children are forcibly prostituted. Worldwide, the best estimates are that 600,000 to 800,000 trafficking victims are moved across international borders every year. Millions more victims are moved within national borders, but anti-trafficking efforts have only recently turned to equipping transportation employees to identify victims in transit. The training is easy, it's inexpensive, and it's already saving lives. In July of 2010, I chaired a conference here in Washington to bring together relevant U.S. agencies such as Customs and Border Patrol, various U.S. airlines and non-governmental organizations to focus on interdicting traffickers by training commercial transportation employees to recognize the indicators for trafficking. Speakers included Deborah Sigmund, who is here with us today, founder of an NGO called Innocence at Risk, explained how flight attendants were the first line of defense in the fight against human trafficking. As a matter of fact, I took her pamphlet and handed out hundreds of copies of that pamphlet to other parliamentarians at the next Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Flight attendants are in a unique position to observe potential trafficking in progress and then call a trafficking hotline to inform the pilot or radio ahead so that proper authorities can intervene. Former flight attendant Nancy Rivard, president of Airline Ambassadors International, one of today's witnesses, told us how she and other flight attendants compared notes one day and were shocked and dismayed at how often they had noticed what they suspected was trafficking or a trafficked woman or child on their flight, but had no training or protocol to do something about it. Nancy has been doing a great deal about it ever since, training airline employees around the United States and around the world. Last year, I was privileged to join Ms. Rivard at a training seminar in Kiev, Ukraine. One of the earliest successes of the program was a call Ms. Rivard placed to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security regarding a child she had observed on her flight from the Dominican Republic to Boston. That tip led to the breakup of a trafficking ring that had transported more than 80 children to the United States. Just this year, last year, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security released a similar training initiative called the Blue Lightning Program, to domestic U.S. airlines. And so far, Delta, JetBlue, Allegiant, and North American Airlines are on board. With minimal modifications, the training is also easily adaptable to bus drivers and station operators, train conductors, trucking associations, and other transportation industry professionals. At one time or another, every trafficking victim will be moved. We need to interdict that movement, rescue the trafficking victim, and put behind bars the person involved with the slave trade. The New Jersey Human Trafficking Task Force, which was originally started with seed money from a law that I authored, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and subsequent reauthorizations, is working overtime to mitigate sex trafficking and has released, like the governor's office, anti-trafficking brochures to bus and train employees in New Jersey, as well as reached out to other major industry on the front lines of spotting traffickers and victims, including hotels. We've included at the press table some of that material, which I encourage you to take a look at. We have with us today the NGO, End Child Prostitution and Trafficking, or ECPAT USA, which has been conducting hotel training on behalf of the task force in the lead-up to the Super Bowl. Hyatt, Hilton, Wyndham, Carlson, and Accor hotels have been establishing a new industry standard to ensure that their properties are not used for human trafficking. In addition to reaching out to transportation employees and hotels, the New Jersey Human Trafficking Task Force has increased print and electronic public service announcements and training programs for law enforcement, healthcare workers, lawyers, and others on the front line. In December, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, not many people perhaps have heard of it, but it's kind of like the human rights counterpart to NATO in Europe, and it's comprised of 57 countries from Europe and North America, endorsed my plan to make anti-trafficking training for airline employees, other public and commercial carriers, as well as hotel employees, a primary goal in the international strategy to combat human trafficking. I want to especially thank the Ukrainian chair in office and the Ukrainian government who took the lead, working side by side with the United States and other interested countries, to make sure that that language was included in the action plan. So thank you, Ukraine. In Istanbul, Turkey, at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly last July, members of parliaments, well over 250, maybe as many as 300, adopted my resolution to implement such a training in each and every country of the 57 nations. Any country that competes to host the next major sporting event must be fully aware of the human trafficking vulnerabilities associated with such events and the best practices for protecting and rescuing victims. In fact, the International Olympic Committee and the Fédération Internationale de Football, or FIFA, should take into consideration a country's anti-trafficking commitment and ability when awarding those games. We will soon be writing a letter to all of these associations asking them to make that part of the criteria. Standard anti-trafficking measures should be included along with the required security measures. Finally, the only standard that fits the crime of human trafficking is zero tolerance, and it must be vigorously and faithfully enforced by arrests of those engaged in this nefarious trade, modern-day slavery. And there could be no higher priority than the liberation and protection of the victims. We've had many victims come to this committee and give their testimony. Through their tears and through their agony, they have asked us, practically begged us, to do more. We have to respond more aggressively. Combating human trafficking must be continuously prioritized at all levels of government, the faith community, civil society, and corporations, including the National Football League, the NFL. All of us must do our part to protect women and girls. I'd like to yield to the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Weber, the gentleman from Texas, and would note Mr. Weber was the prime author of the legislation in Texas, the state law on combating human trafficking, and has been a leader for many, many years. I yield to Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing, and thank you all for being here. I was privileged to be out in California with the ambassador some months back. Chairman Ed Royce held, I guess, a forum out there to talk about this very egregious problem. We take pride in Texas and everything being bigger and better, and unfortunately, this is not one of the records that we want. Texas has the dubious distinction of having about 25% of the human trafficking in the country. So it's something that we take very seriously and we work very hard on. And the chairman is very kind. We were able to pass some landmark legislation to heighten awareness, to increase penalties, to actually ferret out some of what I learned in California. The ambassador might remember they were calling POSs purchasers of sex. We call them POSs in Texas too, but it has a little bit of a different meaning. And I won't repeat that here. So it's a very bad problem, and you're right, we need zero tolerance. And there's a human trafficking hotline, and for the record, it's 888-37-37, 888. It's really easy to remember. And we encourage people, if you think, if you suspect something is out of the ordinary, like the flight attendants we're talking about, please call that hotline. It's important. 888-37-37, 888. And I'll leave it at that for the time being, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. I'd like to now yield to our former ambassador, Ann Wagner, who is not a member of this committee but is so concerned about this issue. She has gotten here early and has joined us. Most members are arriving somewhere around 6 tonight. I yield to the gentlelady, Ms. Wagner.
2nd Congressional District from the St. Louis area. We also, Congressman Weber, sadly are in the top 20 in the nation for sex trafficking, and it's a deplorable statistic. But I thank the chairman and committee members, and I thank you all for convening this hearing today and allowing me to discuss the upcoming Super Bowl and the efforts to combat the surge in sex trafficking that often results from prominent sporting events and conventions such as these. I applaud the committee's effort to increase awareness of this very important issue, especially Chairman Smith's ongoing leadership and dedication to fighting this terrible crime and the effects of the most vulnerable members of our society. As a former United States ambassador, I was exposed firsthand to the horrors of human trafficking on an international level. I witnessed and reported on the devastating consequences of human trafficking where innocent children were dragged into the dark abyss of sex slavery. I worked in close coordination with law enforcement, foreign governments, our U.S. State Department, and the private sector to stop this heinous exploitation from happening. But never, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that human trafficking was so rampant in the United States of America, in our neighborhoods, in our school districts, in our faith communities. While some of my colleagues might think that this could never happen in their own district, there are young women being forced into prostitution right now in virtually every district across this nation. It is hiding in plain sight. According to the United Nations, human trafficking generates $9.5 billion in revenue yearly in the United States. The Department of Justice has estimated that approximately 300,000 children are currently at risk of being prostituted in the United States alone. Shockingly, the average age of entry into prostitution for a child victim in the U.S. is 13 to 14 years old. As a mother and an aunt of teenage daughters, I am especially concerned that the victims be given a voice. They are not nameless, faceless children. They are our daughters, our granddaughters, our nieces, and our neighbors. They are the vulnerable youth of our society, the ones who should be protected the most, not exploited for money and greed. As legislators, we have an obligation to come together and do something because we can, because we should, and because we must. Partnership between the public and private sectors is a key to combating human trafficking at major events like the Super Bowl. That's why I'm happy to see representatives from private industry here today. Many times, frontline employees of the transportation industry, and I certainly recognize Delta Airlines is here and have been a wonderful partner in this regard, and the hospitality industries are the ones best suited to identify trafficking victims and their predators. In addition to sporting events like the Super Bowl, conferences and conventions can also be magnets of sex trafficking. The conference and hospitality industry, along with corporate partners, have a vital role to play in combating sexual exploitation. I'd like to highlight for just a minute the work of the St. Louis company that is a leader in this area, NICS Conference and Meeting Management. It's been especially active through better awareness and educating the industry on the signs of human trafficking. I applaud their efforts to host the 2014 Ignite Conference in St. Louis on March 2nd through the 4th. It's dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering a diverse group of supporters and stakeholders to combating sex trafficking. Increased awareness and training will lead to more victims being identified, which is a critical step in breaking the cycle of exploitation and victimization. But our work does not end there. Congress has the opportunity to take a stand to protect our children from the devastating consequences of sex trafficking. That's why I'm supporting several pieces of bipartisan legislation that would give law enforcement, prosecutors, and social services the necessary tools and resources to combat human trafficking and boost support for the victims. I applaud Representatives Poe and Paulson, Chairman Smith and others, Wahlberg, Carter, Royce, Reichert, Bass, and many, many others for their legislative efforts to fight the scourge of human trafficking. I am committed to making this a legislative priority in 2014. I'd like to briefly mention another issue that demands legislative action. Over the last 10 or so years, prostitution has migrated to an online marketplace. Online classified services such as Backpage.com have become the vehicle for advertising the victims of the child sex trade to the world. Online customers choose websites like Backpage and other advertisers to order an underage girl to their hotel room as easily as if they were ordering a delivery pizza. Now just think about that for a second. Close your eyes and picture your daughter, your niece, or any innocent young girl that you care about being sold for exploitation to a complete stranger. These publicly released pictures that are playing on the television right now could be that innocent angel that you just pictured. It is our moral obligation and our legislative duty to ensure that advertisements of child sex trafficking like Backpage and others are not allowed to operate and claim yet another victim. I end my testimony, Mr. Chairman, today with the highest praise for your efforts and the committee and those here that are here to testify today. I thank you. I thank you, Ambassador. I enjoyed having our conversation and the work that you do at the State Department on an international level. Ms. Odom, I look forward to working with you and your office and receiving the resources and tools and support to get the word out. The efforts of public officials to raise awareness of human trafficking are critical to combating this reprehensible crime. It is only through increased awareness, resources, and legislative action that we will one day realize a society that protects its most vulnerable victims from sexual exploitation and enslavement. I thank you.
Ambassador Widener, thank you so much for your very strong, articulate, and passionate speech. It is nice to know we have somebody who comes from the ambassadorial ranks who brings that understanding and that gravitas. And I think your point about Craigslist and Backpage, I was talking to Jonathan Marino earlier today about Twitter, and we're planning on doing a hearing on those types of media and Twitter's very, very shameless record of promoting the exploitation of women and young girls. So thank you so very much. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Mark Meadows, who is also the delegate to the United Nations from the Foreign Affairs Committee and a very faithful member of this subcommittee on all matters related to human rights and a leader and a champion for human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I just want to speak very briefly, but from the heart. You know, these events, the Super Bowl, lets us highlight human trafficking as an issue just because of the sheer numbers. But day in and day out, we know, Mr. Ambassador, we've spoken before, this is something that continues to affect families and young girls across not just this country, but across the world. And it is only through truly looking at this particular problem and believing that we can conquer it together that we will be successful. Because Super Bowls come and go. Numbers continue to get reported over and over again. And it is very easy to get discouraged and say that we're not making a difference. But as a father, and as a father of a daughter who some 5 years ago highlighted this problem for me and started to share how tragic it is in our country and in our world, it was something that really wasn't on the radar screen for me until she brought it out. And she is now a junior in college, about to graduate. And so her life's calling is really to address this particular issue. And so I said, you know, honey, what do you want to do after you graduate? And she says, oh, well, I really want to get involved to make sure that human trafficking is a thing of the past. And so for all the times that you may be discouraged, whether it's this panel or the panel to come, there are those who are starting to come alongside you to fight to make sure that even if it continues, that we can make a difference, one girl at a time. And I am committed to work alongside each one of you. I thank you for your service and your heart that it represents. And I thank the chairman for holding this hearing and for his undying, relentless pursuit on behalf of those who many times can't speak for themselves. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. We're also joined by another member who's not a member of our subcommittee, but a former sheriff of King County in Washington State, the president of the Washington State Sheriff's Association, and in 2004 won the National Sheriff's Association Sheriff of the Year Award, 2 Valor Awards, and the Washington State Attorney General's Award for Courageous Action. A man of action, a man who knows what it is to combat the bad guy, and has done so successfully. And it's so great to have him here, and a real leader on human trafficking, combating it, Dave Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to attend the hearing today. I came back yesterday especially to be here. I would be on an airplane right now, but this is important for all of us to be here, and thank you all for being here today to attend this hearing. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and grateful for your work in preventing human trafficking. And especially as chairman of this subcommittee and as the co-chair of the House Anti-Human Trafficking Caucus, it is critical that Congress explore how sex trafficking is connected to major sporting events so we can better prevent it from happening. Now, I have a whole prepared statement here that I was going to read, but I'm not going to do that. I might read parts of it, but the statements by the other members have really touched me, and I hope they've touched you. I saw some faces looking at the screen as the faces of the young girls and young women were presented. It brought back memories for me. Maybe some of you in the room already are aware, but I look like I've been in Congress for 40 years, but this is my 10th year. So I had a previous career, and that was with the Sheriff's Office for 33 years. A good portion of my career was working on a serial murder case in Seattle called the Green River murder case. I was 32 years old when I started that case in 1982. It took 19 years. He pled guilty to 49 deaths, murders. I'm not even going to use his name. It sickens me. 49 that he pled guilty to. He probably killed 70 to 80 young girls and young women. We closed 51 cases. I was the lead investigator in that case, and I was at almost every one of those dead body sites. I recovered their remains. I told the parents who found their victims, their daughters dead. Some were missing 6 years. For me, it was sort of I'm a runaway myself. I grew up in a family of domestic violence and ran away and lived in a 1956 Mercury for a while that I happened to buy myself. Fortunately for me, I had a football coach that kind of grabbed me by the back of the collar and put me on the straight and narrow, kept me on the football team, kept me in school. But I understand why young women and young men today run away from home. They're victims of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, domestic violence, alcohol, drug abuse, you name it. I've seen it. I've been there. I've been to the homes. I've taken foster kids from one home to another foster home in the middle of the night with phone calls from foster kids, from young girls and young boys on the street at a phone booth just looking for a place to stay, to get off the street, to find some safety. Back in the 80s, you know, when we had so many prostitutes on the streets of Seattle, and I would imagine similar to today, those young ladies, most of them are young girls and women, are invisible. People go from their job to home, from home to their job, and they don't see them. We need to open our eyes. We need to see them. And I think today the people in this room clearly understand and can see them. And I know a lot of you are already working in this world to try to make it better for these young girls, to find them places to stay. So as a runaway myself, and then going to the sheriff's office and just having the sort of a I happened to walk in front of the sergeant's desk when a body was found, and that's how I was assigned the first Green River victim in 1982. So just by chance for the next many years, that was my calling, to work with those young people on the street and those families. And now here I am in Congress, and I chair the Human Resources Subcommittee on the Ways and Means Committee. And what is my focus? Foster kids and human trafficking. We have got to do a better job, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard that message today, loud and clear. There are a lot of young men and women in this audience, and maybe you've never even met a young girl or a young boy that's lived on the street. You have opportunities in front of you that they may never have, but we need to make it a world where they have those opportunities. So I really want to thank the chairman again for inviting me to be here. I want to say a special thank you to Holly Smith, who will be on the second panel. It takes a lot of courage to come before a group like this and stand and tell your story. And she's here to do that, to help us solve this problem. So, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you very much for inviting me to be here today and very much for the opportunity to make this opening statement. And I appreciate, again, all the hard work by the members of this committee and others in Congress and all of you. Thank you so much.
Chairman Reichert, thank you very much, or should I say Sheriff. Thank you for that very, very incisive and moving account and testimony. I'd like to now introduce our two very distinguished panelists. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome them to the subcommittee. Certainly with Ambassador Lucy DeBacca, I've worked with him for decades, and I thank him for his extraordinary service. Ambassador Lucy DeBacca coordinates U.S. government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery. He serves as senior advisor to the Secretary of State and directs the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which assesses global trends, provides training and technical assistance, and advocates for an end to modern-day slavery. Ambassador C. DeBacca formerly served as the counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary, where his portfolio included trafficking issues. He has also served as a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice, where he convicted dozens of abusive pimps and employers and helped to liberate hundreds of victims from servitude. Without objection, your full bio will be made a part of the record, but thank you for that, again, extraordinary service. We'll then hear from Ms. Maria Odom, who serves in the Department of Homeland Security and the Citizenship and Immigration Services as Ombudsman and as chair of the department's Blue Campaign, the unified voice for DHS's efforts to combat human trafficking through training and public education. Ms. Odom came to the department as a legal expert with a wide range of immigration experience in the government, private, and charitable sectors. Most recently, she led the country's largest network of charitable legal immigration programs as the executive director of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to testify today, for calling this hearing to shine a brighter light on modern slavery and, more importantly, for your years of leadership on this issue. Today, we're focusing on a specific concern that's garnered the attention of the entire anti-trafficking community: human trafficking around major sporting events and lessons that can be learned, especially in the hospitality and transportation sectors. But before we dig down into that issue, it is important to remind ourselves that trafficking in persons does not just occur in isolated places or specific times, nor does it victimize a narrow set of individuals. Trafficking persons is all of the conduct involved in reducing someone to or holding them in a state of compelled service, whether for labor or commercial sex, nothing short of modern-day slavery, affecting every country in the world, estimated to victimize approximately 27 million men, women, and children. It has no place in the 21st century, and every single victim deserves our focus and our attention. As Mr. Reichert reminded us, these are not statistics. These are people worthy of our compassion, deserving of our attention as people with hopes, dreams, and needs, and increasingly survivors with things to teach us if we only would listen. Despite the scope of this crime, around the world, roughly only 40,000 victims of trafficking are being identified each year. So when we suspect that there might be a heightened risk of trafficking, whether relating to a particular industry, a particular migration route, or a major event, we necessarily need to ramp up our efforts to confront this crime, to keep doing what works. And we need to develop fresh ideas for identifying victims, investigating trafficking cases, and enforcing trafficking laws in keeping with Pope Francis's exhortation to not look the other way when we see our brother or sister who is enslaved. In recent years, we've worked with governments and NGOs around the world to address these concerns. And if there's an overarching lesson we've taken away from these cases, it's that efforts to respond to modern slavery need to be sustainable and comprehensive. targeting all forms of trafficking. In many cases, major sporting events not only pose a challenge around sex trafficking, they also require massive construction projects, creating a demand for cost-effective labor and materials. In regions with sizable migrant populations, much of this labor force will cross a border at least once to reach the job site. Once the event takes place, the locations become major destinations for travel and tourism, including in the so-called sex industry. At every step of the process, the vulnerabilities with which we are all familiar, the vulnerabilities to human trafficking. And so addressing these risks for these events means putting safeguards in place every step of the way. What protections exist for the laborers and around the event? What methods are being used to screen those who may be victims of trafficking, including through debt bondage that resulted from paying hefty recruitment fees in their own home countries? How are law enforcement personnel and partners in the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry being trained to identify particular trafficking situations, and not just child sex trafficking, but that of adults, of men as well as women? These are questions governments should be grappling with every day, and especially when a major gathering is on the horizon. And they are some of the things we're watching for as we approach additional major events, whether the Winter Olympics in Russia, the World Cup in Brazil, or the World Cup in Qatar in 2022. We'll continue raising this issue with governments and gathering data to include in our annual Trafficking in Persons report. And my prepared testimony addresses these situations in greater detail. I would ask that it be included in its entirety in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. As we look ahead, the issue of trafficking at sporting events underscores one of the biggest challenges we face in the struggle against modern slavery generally, the relative lack of public data and research on this often hidden issue. At this point, when it comes to major sporting events, including those here in the United States, much of the information we have is anecdotal. Crime reporting statistics are painting an incomplete picture, and the handful of reports that emerge on this topic at times present contradictory findings. So we need to keep gathering data and information about this aspect of the crime. Where is it taking place? Who is it, the criminals that are driving this enterprise? And what is the most effective way to prevent it? Because while our top priority must always be getting victims out of harm's way and bringing criminals to justice, the more we know about the crime, the better we'll be able to stop it from happening in the first place. And we're well equipped to respond to this specific concern thanks to the partners that have rallied around the issue. In the transportation industry, like airline ambassadors and Delta Airlines, in hospitality, like Carlson and Hilton, across government, whether the Department of Transportation or state governments from Indiana to Arizona, Texas to New Jersey. Partnerships like the 11 Orders of Catholic Women who worked with Indianapolis hotels via the Coalition for Corporate Responsibility for Indiana and Michigan, and the continued work that those women have done since 2012. The work of all of our partners can help to make major sporting events safe for all people. But what's perhaps more important is that every person they reach becomes another partner in this effort. The knowledge they spread doesn't expire when the clock ticks down to zero. Once people understand modern slavery, how it touches them, their lives, their communities, how to spot it, and who to call if they do, that knowledge doesn't go away. Just as the human traffickers do not go away when the stadium lights are dimmed. And perhaps it's that ripple effect that's just as important as stopping trafficking at major events, because it is a 365-day-a-year crime that requires a 365-day-a-year response. As Rachel Lloyd, who founded the New York-based service provider GEMS, recently wrote, "No matter what happens this week in New Jersey, she anticipates serving close to 400 girls and young women this year in the New York area, and she knows that she will need daily food, Metro cards, stipends, toiletries, clothing, diapers, milk, and funds for education, leadership, and employment training programs so that they can support and empower those young women every day of every year. As more and more people and institutions contribute to that response, we grow nearer and nearer to our shared goal, a world free from slavery." Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ms. Odom.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, members of the subcommittee, Congresswoman Wagner, and Congressman Rayburn. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on behalf of the dedicated men and women of the Department of Homeland Security and discuss our collective efforts to combat human trafficking. As Chairman Smith indicated, we are here today painfully aware that human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery, that it is a crime that involves the exploitation of someone for the purposes of compelled labor or commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Every year, millions of men, women, and children worldwide, including in the United States, are victims of human trafficking. DHS shares responsibility with the U.S. Department of Justice for investigating human trafficking, arresting suspected traffickers, and protecting victims. To better coordinate our efforts, in 2010, the department established the Blue Campaign. We know that fighting the hidden crime of human trafficking is a collaborative effort, and DHS depends on strong partnerships with other federal agencies, foreign governments, law enforcement, first responders, the faith-based and community partners, as well as private members of the private sector. The Blue Campaign marshals resources from every corner of the Department of Homeland Security from across the nation and around the globe. DHS and the Blue Campaign focus on prevention through increased community education, a strategic public service awareness campaign, and sector-diverse partnerships. We focus on protection of victims through coordination of comprehensive victim services and prosecution of those responsible for this heinous crime through ICE's investigations and our targeted training of state, local, and tribal law enforcement partners. Today, I'd like to share information with you about our Blue Lightning initiative. Blue Lightning is a voluntary training program initiated by DHS with the support and the leadership of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Department of Transportation. Other collaborators of our Blue Lightning initiative include Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center, the Transportation Security Administration, the Federal Air Marshals, the Federal Aviation Administration, NGO partners, and the private industry. The core of Blue Lightning is the partnership with the airline industry. Airline personnel can be helpful in identifying potential victims and report suspected human trafficking events to law enforcement, beginning with ticket agents who routinely handle travel documents and question passengers as part of their check-in and boarding, and continuing with flight crews. These employees have extended time with travelers and opportunities for interactions. They are skilled observers, and with the appropriate training, they too can be the front line against human trafficking. Blue Lightning provides educational materials for U.S. commercial airline employees. Once trained, airline personnel become a force multiplier in the fight against trafficking, enabling DHS to remove human trafficking victims from harm while helping to disrupt a current and ongoing potential trafficking event. Participating airlines voluntarily integrate the Blue Lightning training module into the airline's initial or refresher training for flight attendants, customer service representatives, and other personnel. The Blue Lightning training includes a computer-based training module which provides a basic overview of trafficking, an outline of the indicators of human trafficking, and lessons to report how to report human trafficking through the use of flight deck communications and coordination with the Federal Air Marshal Service. Airline personnel may also submit tips and report potential human trafficking events to federal law enforcement via ICE's phone and online tip lines. These real-time reporting mechanisms provide law enforcement officials with needed time to coordinate an appropriate response before the plane arrives. Since the launch of Blue Lightning this past June, we have entered into agreements with 5 participating airlines, resulting in the training of tens of thousands of aviation employees in less than a year. Since its launch, CBP has received 13 suspected human trafficking tips, all of them through each of the Blue Lightning reporting mechanisms. The protocol is working. As professional stewards of flight safety, aviation personnel are important partners in our government's efforts to end human trafficking and protect lives. We look forward to our continued work with the airlines and we look forward to working with all of you. We thank you for your commitment to this important issue. Thank you for your time today. My testimony provides additional information. We're always happy to supplement it, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Ms. Odom, thank you very much for your leadership and for your testimony today.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'd like to ask, first of all, Mr. Ambassador, if you could, I know that you interact and not only travel, but receive delegations probably almost every day. I know I meet with delegations often, legislative as well as executive branch people, and I always give them the tip report, whatever our best practices up to that date is, whether it be for the military, for any aspect, including trying to get this situation awareness campaign regarding airlines and other means of transportation across to them. And I'm wondering, since you especially meet with the Tier 2 watch list folks, the Tier 3 countries, what has been the reaction from those tip leaders who very often are very deeply committed themselves, often up against a very reluctant executive branch or prime minister or lethargic parliament or Congress, to really take on what the Blue Lightning campaign is doing and what you know can actually save lives. Are they responsive to it?
I think, one of the things that we've seen typically with the governments that we talk to, as far as specifically the transportation industry, but I also try to raise the issues around the hospitality industry as well, knowing that there's often not the same posture of the government vis-a-vis that. You also often have government ownership of rail or even airlines. I think that it's an issue that governments are starting to come to. I think we moved beyond the blank stare response with a few of the governments. I think that one of the hardest things, of course, is that often the countries that are on Tier 3 and Tier 2 watch list, as you've mentioned, are countries that don't necessarily have the strongest intergovernmental structures. And so what we've seen, for instance, in the United Kingdom, where we've got some of the airlines that are looking at some of these issues as well with Virgin Atlantic specifically, and others, is that those are very functioning governments as far as ministries that truly do regulate their transportation, ministries that are able to talk to each other and to bring in the anti-trafficking ethos of the Home Ministry, of the Justice Ministry, of the Foreign Ministry into these other parts of the government. And frankly, we do see many of the Tier 3 and Tier 2 watch list countries as not having as robust of a conversation across their ministries. So one of the things that we've been doing to try to start that up is to very much use the model of the Senior Policy Operating Group, the President's Interagency Task Force, et cetera, and not only across the agencies, but the things that we've seen, for instance, at DHS and others who have done an internal survey across all of their components to drive these issues out. And I think that that's where we're seeing the difference. I can't say that we've seen national airlines or national railways or others ramp up their efforts the way that we've seen here in the United States, but I think it's something that we're going to continue to push out to our foreign counterparts.
Can I just ask you, are you satisfied with the state-federal cooperation? For example, on Friday, the U.S. Attorney General for the state for our region in New Jersey joined the state Attorney General and other interested parties at a Friday rollout of many of the things they're trying to do to stop trafficking relative to the Super Bowl. Do you find that there is a good cooperation with states, not just foreign states, but also United States, especially as it relates to this Super Bowl?
I think that we've certainly seen that, and I think that New Jersey is a good example of that. Frankly, we've seen that around a number of the last Super Bowls. I think that some of that actually flows from the prioritization of this in a bipartisan fashion by the National Association of Attorneys General. I think this was something that we certainly have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, and the leadership among the Attorneys General often then has been able to piggyback on that. So if you see the leadership that Attorney General Abbott, for instance, had in Texas, that was very much in keeping with the work that he was doing on the Pillars of Hope campaign of the National Association of Attorneys General. So I think it's starting to come together. What's interesting is that it's coming together more through political will and commitment on the part of both state and federal actors than it is in the way that other projects sometimes come together. As you know, there's a very successful set of almost pilot project local task forces, the ACT teams that the Department of Justice puts out. But that is not in every judicial district, that's not in every congressional district, and it's not in every state. And so I think that what we've seen is that kind of energy very much comes from the actors involved rather than necessarily the funding streams.
Let me ask you, Ms. Odom, and I'll just ask a few questions, then yield to my colleagues and submit a number of questions for the record. But at previous, and you too, Mr. Ambassador, you might want to answer this. At previous Super Bowls, we've seen social media advertisements for prostitution increase in the lead up to the games. We know that Twitter, as I mentioned before, and again, talking to some individuals before this hearing, we talked about Twitter at great length. Backpage, which was mentioned very strongly by our former ambassador to Liechtenstein. Are you satisfied we're making a difference in the social media, which we've seen it with Craigslist. Time and again, members of Congress, including myself, have written to the Craigslist founder, and they are unmoved. There needs to be prosecution, and vigorous prosecution, it would seem to me, for being part of an absolutely horrific and scandalous and illegal operation. Your thoughts on that? Secondly, Ms. Odom, if you could speak to how can we accelerate the buy-in from the other airlines? You know, Delta is here. We will be hearing from them shortly, and I think it's very significant that the wife of the president of Delta is here with us as well, Anna Bashian, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, underscoring the commitment of that airline. Our hope was that all the airlines would be here, and I'm not going to bash them, but please join the effort. The time has come. What are you finding? How do we accelerate that effort to get them on board?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe with regards to monitoring social media and incorporating the evaluation of social media activity as part of the investigative efforts is part of what HSI, ICE HSI continues to do. I believe that they're looking at it in a holistic way, and with regards to the Super Bowl preparation, for example, their outreach and training efforts as part of the Newark Task Force have proven to be very helpful, and their goal is to conduct their activities, all of their law enforcement activities, with a heightened level of awareness and screening for human trafficking. So I am satisfied that their engagement at the state and local level has been robust. The ICE HSI special agents in charge have shown a commitment, energy, and enthusiasm for working with their state and local counterparts, and I believe that is a key part of our work, is to train, to educate, to be a resource to the state and local counterparts, and I'm satisfied that that is happening. With regards to the expansion of the Blue Lightning Initiative to include other airlines, our partners at CBP continue very active efforts to educate, to visit with, to share information about Blue Lightning and the training materials that we continue to generate with the support of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center with other airlines. I am satisfied that their efforts are very meaningful, and I hope that when I come back next time I can report on some progress and we can have more airlines. I believe hearings such as this one are important because it does tell the other airlines what their counterparts are doing, how they're engaging and training their workforce, and why it makes a difference. So I think this hearing is very important, and I thank you for hosting.
I would respectfully suggest nothing sharpens the mind of a corporation or an individual than a deadline. A deadline to try to have everybody on board might be helpful as a means to that end. Say, everybody on board by the end of 2014.
Okay, thank you.
Just a thought.
One thing that I'd like to respond to, Mr. Smith, on the issue of the airline efforts, I think that with consolidation, hopefully the American-U.S. Air relationship will be able to extend in the good work of airline ambassadors, which has done so much of its good work coming out of the relationships from the American Airlines staff who founded that organization. But I think you're right, it's that notion of something more formal. We actually, I think, would like to go even one further, which is after we see that kind of training, as you've suggested, perhaps a universal or company-wide training by the carriers, then starting to look at the other aspects. The executive order that President Obama issued on government procurement, for instance, is in its final stages with the notice and comment period having closed at the end of December, which basically is putting out the notion that if somebody wants to do business with the federal government, they need to have standards about tracking their supply chains. They need to have zero-tolerance policies against their people engaging in sex trafficking and facilitating those things. And I think that that's one of the things that we're going to want to talk to the carriers and others about as well, which is making sure that that folks have the skills to recognize and interdict and make the recommendations and the referrals to law enforcement if they see something happening in the equipment, but also where's that shrimp being bought? Where's the cloth on the seats being sourced from, et cetera. Looking at the entire business model of the transportation industry and what kind of footprint it has on the overarching issues of modern slavery around the world.
Mr. Weber?
Ms. Odom, you said that there was 13 tips from the airlines, and then you said there was 5 participating airlines. And you may have this in your testimony, and I haven't looked at it. What 5 airlines are those?
Sure. We have Allegiant Air, Delta Airlines, North American Airlines, and Silver Airways, as well as JetBlue Airways Corporation.
Okay, as we were saying when you come up to introduce yourself, you know, Texas has that dubious distinction, as I said earlier, of having a lot of human trafficking, so we'd love to get Southwest Airlines and American Airlines. Are you proactive in reaching out to them and saying, please get on board with this?
Yes, sir, we are. And Secretary Napolitano sent a secretarial letter on the Blue Lightning Initiative to 93 airlines, including Southwest Airlines, and Customs and Border Protection, who is the agency that is leading the Blue Lightning Initiative in collaboration with the Blue Campaign, constantly reaches out to the airlines. So they are very active in following up with all 93 carriers that received that initial letter from the Secretary.
Have they responded to you at all?
There's an ongoing dialogue back and forth, and there are some agreements in the works which we're not prepared to announce yet because they're not finalized. But I think it's promising. And we're not talking about, you know, dozens, but I think it's small progress, and we are monitoring our program very carefully. It's 6 months old, and we're very satisfied with the airlines that have joined so far, and motivating other airlines to do so.
Well, I would like for my office to write a letter to Southwest Airlines, American Airlines, and get involved in saying, hey, y'all need to, you know, come get on board with this, if that'll help.
That would be very helpful.
So if you get in touch with our office. Now, as I was saying when y'all were up here at the front, Mr. Chairman, in Texas, we have the TABC, Texas Alcohol Bureau of Control, and they could go into a lot of these bars and things, and the great thing in Texas is they don't need a warrant. They can go in because of state law to review alcohol purchase records and to make sure there's no underage drinking going on, and there's no after-hours drinking going on, and so they can basically show up unannounced. So I was encouraging Ms. Odom to incorporate that, because it's a great tool. Their representatives can go in there and get their eyes there. And you talk about somebody trained to recognize human trafficking. These are individuals that are trained and can spot that, and then they don't have to have a probable cause. They're there, and then when they see with their eyes, then they've got the probable cause. So I would encourage you all to try to form those partnerships. I don't know how it works in other states, but at least in Texas it works well. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Wagner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I'm also interested, Ms. Odom, and thank you for your testimony. Thank both of you for your fine testimony and work on this. Any other modes of transportation? Can you report at all on rail, on bus, car, caravan? Is there any work being done in that regard?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We recognize that we need to expand this initiative to other modes of transportation. Our partners at the Department of Transportation are in very active and current conversations with us as we continue to draw strategies to reach out to the bus especially the bus industry, the cruise lines and other industries that we believe should be part of this effort. We're not prepared to report on any progress there, but I can leave you with my commitment that we're working very hard at expanding this initiative to other modes of transportation.
Great, thank you. That's great to hear. And I would tell the gentleman from Texas that I would also be pleased to help out on a letter to some of the other airlines that certainly have interest in the St. Louis regional airport and travel area. You know, we've talked a lot here today about awareness, about education. I certainly, legislatively, am going to look at some prosecutorial things, some law enforcement things, resources, but much of this is us pulling together as a team. Awareness and education is absolutely clear, and we've seen this, I think, in the transportation industry in many instances, certainly in the hotel and convention industry, certainly among so many of our flight attendants and in others. We need to talk about the corporate community, I think, somewhat too. And I would encourage the chairman and perhaps other committees also to talk about awareness and educational policies and principles with different HR departments of corporates. We should have corporate partners that are involved in this. Oftentimes, it is those corporations that are sending their staff, their employees, their teams down to these conventions. And I know that there are sensitivity trainings that go on from HR departments on multiple different issues, but certainly including one on sex trafficking and human trafficking at all levels would be very, very important in this area. Also, I've spoken with some educators and school teachers. You know, there are also reasons why at a counselor level, especially with these young girls, as I said, the average age 13 to 14, girls and boys, I will say, that education among counselors to recognize the victims, to talk about how they operate. And we visited a little bit, Ms. Odom, about that earlier today, and how quickly these predators can prey on these young, innocent children who then find themselves in a vicious cycle of sex slavery. So I would encourage us as legislators and as people involved in this cause to continue with that kind of awareness and education. And I, like the chairman, also agree and believe in deadlines and pledges and holding folks accountable through actual activity and actionable items. So I hope that we can also try to do this. It's in all of our best interests. Again, I think that so often, as my colleague, Mr. Congressman Meadows said, until someone brings it to their attention, it is hiding in plain sight, and people just don't realize how prevalent this is in our society, in the United States of America, and certainly across the world. So I thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Meadows?
Thank each of you for your testimony. Certainly to hear about the Blue Lightning program is something that's encouraging. I guess my only caution would be that when we develop a program, there are certain companies who take it and run with it and are passionate about it. There are others who put it on as a resume, you know, that we're part of this. And so what you could do, Ms. Odom, to highlight those who take it on passionately, whether that's recognizing them annually, whether that's applauding their efforts. I want to certainly applaud Delta Airlines, not only for their involvement, but for them being here today. As a member of Congress who lives less than 2.5 hours from Atlanta, they are a great corporate citizen, and I think this goes a long ways. And I know as someone who travels quite a bit, you know, if I have a choice between someone who is being a good corporate citizen and someone who's not, I will certainly make those choices, financial choices. So, so to the extent that you can do that, I would encourage that.
Congressman, I'm happy to do that. What we have seen through the voluntary engagement of airlines with the Blue Lightning Initiative has been tremendous corporate leadership. We will go back. I will go back and discuss with our team and our partners how to best celebrate corporate commitment and the deployment of resources to fighting human trafficking. I think that's an excellent idea. I'd like to be able to highlight their passion in a way that serves to inform other airlines of these efforts. So, thank you.
And let me follow up on one other area because it's really gets to the heart of training for TSA. We're doing this with regards to the private sector, and yet in talking to some of the folks at TSA, and I'm not meaning this to be derogatory, but in talking to them, their training on this particular aspect is at best minimal. And many times non-existent. So what can we do either legislatively or to encourage policy to make this a critical component for those TSA that see every single passenger? We have to go through that. And again, it's not meaning to be critical. I'm looking for solutions here.
Thank you, Congressman. I think this is a very good question because we have been discussing, I have, in preparation for this hearing and trying to understand how our own workforce at DHS has made progress in receiving training, our very own training modules on indicators of human trafficking. I learned that back in 2012, TSA implemented our basic indicators training and achieved 100% training of the federal air marshals. They also achieved 98% training of the TSA workforce using the online learning center, but the numbers have declined. And I will go back and engage with TSA to find other operationally reasonable and feasible ways to continue to train their workforce. We receive support from TSA in the way of having staff in the Blue Campaign assist us for coming from TSA, and they're good ambassadors from their agency to the Blue Campaign. Not all of the Blue Campaign training modules have been adopted by TSA. Some have, but not all 7. So we continue to work with all of the department components at DHS to make sure that they continue to receive training. Right now, it is mandated for all law enforcement personnel, and we have trained an incredible number of folks in our workforce across the country. So it's a work in progress. I appreciate the concern. We're very much aware of it, and we continue to make efforts.
What I would ask from you then, and not in terms of your oral testimony today, but I would ask for you to submit to this committee, if you would, are 3 recommendations on how we could augment that training for our TSA employees. And the second part of that is what either legislatively we can do as members of Congress to either require or encourage that particular training to happen. So if you would submit that for the record, I'd greatly appreciate it.
We will, thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to say thank you so much for continuing to work on this particular area. You've been here before this committee before. It is something that not only is near and dear to my heart, but as you've heard the passionate plea from Ms. Wagner to my left, it is something that internationally we are needing to address as well. I think if we focus on some of what's happening in our own backyard to highlight it, it helps us highlight it internationally. I know there are a number of ambassadors' wives who are working right now on this particular issue here in Washington, D.C. It was a great encouragement to me to start to hear some of that. It's something my wife has been able to team up with them on. But I guess specifically as it relates to something that you mentioned in terms of federal contracting, some of the other areas we need to do, how can we make more teeth on the economic side of that, whether it be with trade partners or whether it be individually? What can we do to highlight this issue?
Well, I think that in my former prosecutorial ways, maybe coming to the forefront here, but I do think that enforcement is one of the most important things. And I think that, what we've seen typically is that we have rules in the United States that date back to the 1930s on the importation of goods that are tainted by forced labor and other things. And yet those often don't get enforced. And it's not because our folks in the customs realm are trying not to. It's that there are, is my understanding, there are some legal issues out there as far as the consumptive demand requirement and some other things. I know that Senator Grassley's wrestled with this a little bit since he was in a garment factory in Jordan a couple years ago. And I think it's something that if there were to be a little more energy around that on both sides of the building, that we probably would respond and be able to sit down and have some ideas. I think that's one of the things that I know from working cases when I was a justice is that nothing focuses the mind of an importer quicker than a shipping container that is not getting let out of the port. And I think that that's something that we could look at. I think it's going to take engagement. It's going to take the development of industry standards. It's going to take not only the enforcement, but then also the development, just like we've seen with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, of a practice area in the law firms and others who are doing the compliance advisory work, that are doing the risk analysis. If right now what we have is encouraging them to do well, then it's not risk analysis. At that point, it looks like good corporate citizenship, or it looks like corporate social responsibility, all of which are important. But we need to bring the folks from the compliance and the risk analysis parts of the companies to bear as well, simultaneously.
Well said. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Chairman Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. Odom, you mentioned there's a mandated training for law enforcement. Do you know if the curriculum in the academies for those law enforcement personnel includes this topic? Is it academy training?
Thank you, Congressman. It is a training that has been designed by a human trafficking expert at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. In fact, that individual is detailed to the Blue Campaign on a full-time basis and helps us develop our training, which is what is deployed to the various components across DHS.
So around human trafficking, they get academy training, and then what we used to call in our sheriff's office in Seattle was retread, which is a yearly update of all the laws and additional training sessions. Do you have something like that in place?
We have the initial training for law enforcement personnel, Congressman, and then in addition to that, we continue to develop training videos and other web-available resources. Right now, we're producing 11 training videos, many of which are geared to law enforcement. They can be used as roll call videos to be shown right before a shift. They're also produced at rest stops around different sites where you would ordinarily see traffickers and abusing their victims. So we have 11 new training videos that are being produced as we speak. So we're constantly trying to refresh the training, but we're also trying to create for refresher trainings for those individuals who have taken initial training, as well as resources that can be deployed to state and local law enforcement for those folks who have not had initial human trafficking awareness education yet. So we're trying to create different levels of training for folks who are more experienced or those who are newcomers to this particular issue. In addition to that, ICE HSI agents, the special agents in charge across the country, are also training at the state and local level, and they're bringing to the table the resources of the local HSI office, connecting with state and local law enforcement and conducting training, also along with our NGO partners, with USCIS, who also comes to the table to teach law enforcement about relief available to foreign victims of trafficking and their role as well in combating human trafficking through the authorities that we have to provide relief to those individuals.
I think those are wonderful efforts, and it goes to Mr. Meadows' question as to how you might augment training within your organization. And I don't know what sort of time is allocated in the academy, but I know as a, Well, I went to the academy a long time ago. And those things that are important to the community and important to the police department or the sheriff's office are those things that are trained and taught right up front. And if you have a segment on human trafficking in your academies, that's I think a robust training academy package. I think it really sends a strong message to new employees that this is indeed an important issue for this country. Secondly, I'm really excited to learn about the efforts that everyone has put forth in addressing all the modes of travel that people use in human trafficking. So I think back to 1982, and of course the bus system was widely used back then. I spent a lot of time at a bus station downtown Seattle. I won't name the name, but it was a place where they met and arranged rides. Of course, cars, was another. But even back in the 80s, the travel from Seattle to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, to San Diego, up to Vegas, to Reno, back to Seattle again, up to Anchorage. I traveled to New York. I spent time I was two and a half weeks back here on the East Coast, tracking down a couple of pimps and two young ladies that were with them over one of the cases involved in the Green River case. I ended up in New York, in Buffalo, back to New York, and in Atlantic City, and down to Reading, Pennsylvania, and all the way back up to Niagara Falls, where we finally caught them. So I just can't imagine in today's world how quickly they're able to move. And this is such a critical part of addressing this problem. So I'm appreciative of the efforts that you put forth there. That it has to be done. The education and the training has to be done. But the most important thing, I think, is prevention. And I think everyone in this room recognizes that. And in the subcommittee that I chair on Ways and Means, we've been focusing on a particular group of young people in the foster care system who are just vulnerable kids. And I think I touched on that a little bit in my opening statement. One of the things that we learned in that hearing is that a large percentage of children who've been sexually trafficked had come from the foster care system. Of the children reported missing who were likely sex trafficking victims, 60% were in foster care or group homes when they ran away. I think we can make a huge difference in this arena. So my question is for Ms. Odom. So what is the Department of Homeland Security doing? Are you working with child welfare agencies, DSHS, and others to address the foster care issue and their likelihood of ending up in the human trafficking world as victims?
Thank you, Congressman. I believe personally, from listening to the testimony of survivors during that hearing, I can share that one thing that stayed with me was the fact that survivors reported that they often saw their pimp as the one stable person in their lives because they went from family to family, and that was home to them. That person for a long time meant stability for them, and I thought that was such a tragic statement. It stayed with me. I believe it is key for us to address our children in foster care. The Blue Campaign has a long list of audiences that we're trying to reach, and that includes judges, it includes first responders, it includes faith-based communities, all of our partners, survivor networks, and we're very busy trying to create effective strategies so that we're reaching all those audiences. And this is one audience where we can do better in reaching. Our partners at HSI recognize that the need is there to engage with social services providers, with folks who are working in the foster care system, to understand the problem better, to understand the data, to understand the issue, and find a way to investigate and bring these individuals to justice. I look forward to working with our colleagues at HSI to better understand their strategy to reach and rescue victims that are trapped in the foster care system. They are currently evaluating the information. They want you to know that they know it's a problem, that they're actively putting their arms around it and trying to figure out how to deploy resources to address this particular population. I'll be happy to respond to you later with their strategy for reaching to children in the foster care system. I will also be happy to report back to you on what activities the Blue Campaign will develop around outreach, education, and engagement with the foster care community. We still have a long ways to go in that area, but we have so many audiences that we're trying to reach as well, and I think we're making progress.
Well, I can tell you're passionate about this issue, and you have a lot of compassion. I can see that in your voice, and hear it in your voice, and see it in your face. My subcommittee staff and I would be happy to work with you on this issue. We will be introducing legislation here within the next few weeks regarding human trafficking and foster care, so we would look to work with you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I go to the next panel, I'd just like to ask Ambassador Lucy DeBacca, if you would, and with respect, ask U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder if he would really initiate an effort to crack down on Twitter, Backpage, Craigslist, and these other social media that are the conduit for this terrible exploitation of women. Again, in a conversation with Jonathan Marino earlier, he went into great detail as to how Twitter has exploded on the scene with trafficking promotion. So if you could bring that back to the Attorney General of the United States and ask him to crack down, deeply appreciate it.
I'll certainly relay that, sir, and I would love to hear more about the information on Twitter, and perhaps that's something that we can talk about directly with Mr. Marino. But if not, I hope that we can circle back through your office as necessary.
Thank you. And thank you both. We will have other questions we'll submit for the record. we all appreciate your very extraordinary work, and I thank you again. We thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, beginning first with Ms. Polly Hansen, who is the Chief of Police for the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, better known as Amtrak. She has been in this position since December of 2012. Chief Hansen spent 27 years with the Metro Transit Police Department right here in Washington, where she advanced up through the ranks from police officer and served as chief police. She then worked at the Metropolitan Police Department in D.C. as the executive director of the Strategic Services Bureau, and then as director of the Office of Law Enforcement and Security at the U.S. Department of Interior. We'll then hear from Ms. Nancy Rivard, who is president and founder of Airline Ambassadors International, which seeks to provide humanitarian aid to children in need and international development and relief to underprivileged communities around the world. Nancy has expanded Airline Ambassadors International to include 6,000 members, including some outside the airline industry. She has started the Airline Trafficking Initiative at Airline Ambassadors International and created a training program that teaches airline personnel to identify and properly report potential cases of human trafficking. There's no way, having worked with her so closely for several years, that I or anyone else can overstate her tenacity and commitment and effectiveness. We'll then hear from Ms. Carol Smolensky from ECPAC USA. She is the executive director of the group End Child Prostitution and Trafficking USA, and has been working in the field of children's rights for over 20 years. She has overseen the development of numerous projects aimed at stopping the commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking of children, including recent work in New Jersey and New York with the hotel industry in preparation for the Super Bowl. She has presented testimony in venues ranging from the New York City Council to the United Nations to Congress and to the United Nations, like I said. Her work over the years has been very informative and helpful as we've crafted laws here, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and the reauthorizations that followed. Her research has been very timely and accurate, which has helped us to really craft strategies, which she helped to craft as well. So thank you so very much. We'll then hear from Ms. Letty Ashworth, who is General Manager of Global Diversity at Delta Airlines, leading in Delta's global strategy to further develop and advance an efficient, effective, and diverse workforce reflecting an increasingly interconnected world. She works closely with various Delta business units, including finance, commercial, and supply chain, in their efforts to recruit diverse talent. She oversees the company's 7 employee network groups, the RISE mentoring program, and the Delta Wrenched Hearts support group. She has served on numerous boards, including the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking, where she chairs the Human Trafficking Subcommittee. Finally, we will hear from Ms. Holly Smith, who is a survivor of child trafficking and an advocate against all forms of human trafficking. She has submitted joint testimony to Congress and addressed the Virginia General Assembly. Ms. Smith has appeared on the Dr. Oz show and was featured in Cosmopolitan magazine. In addition to working as a training consultant for the Amber Alert program, she works with survivors and anti-human trafficking organizations across the country. The film, Finding Faith, is based on portions of Holly's story. When she isn't speaking, she writes a weekly column with the Washington Times Communities and is working on a book about child sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children in America. Chief Hansen, if you could begin.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith and other distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. As stated, my name is Polly Hansen, and I am the chief of the Amtrak Police Department. Like you, we at Amtrak are deeply concerned about the problem of human trafficking, and I'm honored to appear today on behalf of Mr. Boardman, our CEO and president, and the men and women of Amtrak and our police department. We're a police department of 500 sworn and civilian personnel stationed at more than 30 locations in 46 states, tasked with ensuring the safety and security of Amtrak's passengers, 20,000 plus employees, and substantial infrastructure. The Amtrak police have always taken their responsibility to ensure every passenger has a safe and secure trip every day very seriously, and our commitment is supported by the partnerships that we have at state, local, and federal levels. Our work with the Department of Homeland Security is multifaceted, ranging from collaboration with TSA, federal air marshals who serve as Viper teams at stations across the country, and an initiative with the Department of Homeland Security about human trafficking. Our participation in the initiative to prevent human trafficking began on April 5th of 2012 when DHS and the Department of Transportation formally requested a partnership with Amtrak that involved training and employing awareness about this important issue. In response to this request, all Amtrak police officers, train service, onboard service, station managers, and their frontline employees were given training. Amtrak police officers were provided with training on human trafficking that involved the DHS training video and briefing materials developed by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. To train the larger workforce, we utilized the DHS Human Trafficking General Awareness computer-based training program. We felt it was important for our frontline managers to take this training so they could brief and provide information to their employees who work directly with our passengers. Printed training materials were also distributed and discussed with frontline employees during job briefings and at our safety meetings. Following this initial phase of employee training, the computer-based training program and training materials were delivered to all our remaining employees through a company-wide employee communication managed by Amtrak's corporate communications section. We've also participated in the Blue Campaign and DHS Council on Combating Violence Against Women stakeholder event that was held at the DH Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in Washington, D.C. in August of 2013, and we continue to partner with DHS on the following. We're working with the Office of the Secretary, U.S. Department of Homeland Security staff to develop a second round of human trafficking training material for Amtrak employees. The Amtrak Police is working with the Office of the Secretary, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of the Transportation Office of the Secretary of Transportation staff to develop co-branded posters that meet the requirements of the various state-level human trafficking campaigns. Amtrak will soon display, in fact, I'm told it's supposed to be this afternoon, human trafficking videos on the television screens in all our stations, or the 16 that have them. In addition to those efforts, we've been partnering with the U.S. Border Patrol, and beginning next week, there will be a 7-minute video on security and safety, airing at the locations where we have the TV screens, and it pertains to cross-border travel into Canada and will include a segment on human trafficking. Further, we're also an active partner with the FBI's Law Enforcement Online Network, and we recently distributed an intelligence briefing specific to human trafficking concerns related to the Super Bowl. I want to close by reiterating our commitment to helping DHS and our law enforcement partners in the community to address this serious problem. While we're a transportation provider, the Amtrak Police Department is committed to working with our transportation community to prevent trafficking at a very vulnerable point, which is when people are in transit. With a strong workforce of well-trained law enforcement professionals who thoroughly understand our operations, we're working to ensure that our response is effective and adapts to both changing criminal tactics and identified law enforcement best practices. I want to assure you that our President and CEO, Mr. Boardman, strongly supports our participation in these initiatives, as I do, as a part of Amtrak's mission for safety and security of our passengers every day. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Chief Hansen, so very much for your testimony. I'd like to now we'll go from left to right, your right to left. Ms. Rivard?
Thank you again, Congressman Smith, and it's an honor to be able to testify to the committee. I'm Nancy Rivard, President of Airline Ambassadors. It is documented that human trafficking activity increases around major sporting events, and traffickers move their victims to these cities using all forms of transportation, including airlines. Airline Ambassadors was established in 1996 as the only independent charity of the airline industry. We have been on the forefront of raising awareness on this issue since correctly identifying trafficking on 4 flights in 2009. One of these cases led to the bust of a human trafficking ring in Boston involving 82 children. After researching the issue, we learned that the U.S. had signed the Palermo Protocol in the year 2000, committing, among other things, to stop the use of commercial airlines as a means of transport for trafficking offenses. We were appalled to learn that no action had been implemented. As flight attendants, we knew that airlines have infrastructure to provide training at virtually no additional cost during annual emergency procedure training. An effective protocol could be established for ground personnel to receive calls from pilots regarding potential trafficking. We solicited Congressman Smith to provide a briefing to airlines in 2010, and as a result, American Airlines issued a bulletin to flight personnel and later incorporated the proper procedure into crew manuals. We worked closely with Customs Border Protection to develop an industry-specific training consistent with the Blue Lightning Protocol. We have provided complimentary trainings 20 times, starting in 2011 before the Super Bowl in Dallas, and up to last week at Mineta San Jose Airport with Congressman Honda as part of an effort to raise awareness in the Bay Area before Super Bowl 2016 in Santa Clara. The DH established protocol trains airline crew to pay attention to passengers boarding flights, be alert for children and who they are traveling with, as well as young people traveling alone, or anyone appearing nervous, unsure of their destination, or in control of someone else. Flight attendants are taught to interact with passengers in a friendly, non-threatening manner, giving them opportunities to gather information and vastly increase intelligence regarding potential trafficking situations. We train crew to be alert for indicators, but never to try to rescue a victim or display unusual concern or alarm. If uncomfortable, they are to report the situation to the cockpit with the seat numbers of passengers. Pilots are to call Station Operation Command at the arrival airport and in turn call the DHS tip line to alert law enforcement for proper assessment. Although positive momentum has begun with several airlines adopting the DHS Blue Lightning computer-based training, the truth is that major airlines are still not adequately training their staff by emphasizing this in classroom training and establishing procedures for ground personnel. The typical flight attendant glosses through online trainings as fast as they can, and very little of the information covered is retained unless emphasized in classroom instruction. When I attended emergency procedure trainings in June of 2013, there was one slide out of several hundred on this protocol in the online portion, and it was not mentioned in the classroom. Afterwards, our team visited Station Operation Command Center, where flights all over the world were being monitored. We asked a supervisor what he would do if a pilot reported potential human trafficking situation, and he said, "I would take no action in this situation. It is not a threat to aircraft security and not in my realm of responsibility." This has to change. For the protocol to be effective, all employees must be aware of it and all employees must be trained. They must understand that human slavery is a reality and that their action or inaction can save a life. American Airlines has begun including a scenario in the classroom training for new hire flight attendants, and this is a move in the right direction. Silver Airline uses both DHS computer training as well as airline ambassadors training in the classroom. They have told us that the classroom training is more profound and touching, therefore more effective. Flight attendants carry flashlights as part of their uniform requirement, and we produced flashlight cards and wallet cards with key indicators and the tip line number for easy access, which we will gladly make available to US-based airlines. We will also continue providing awareness trainings at major airports as a public service. Our next training in Phoenix at the Super Bowl, the home of Super Bowl 2015, with Innocence at Risk, has over 120 flight attendants already committed from American Airlines, Alaska, Delta, Frontier, United, Southwest, US Air, SkyWest, and more, who are spending their own time and money to attend. Flight crew are hungry for knowledge and want to be a front line of defense in this horrific crime. Airline ambassadors also hosted a meeting in late 2013 with every major flight attendant and pilot union, representing over 100,000 flight crew. We received huge support on this issue, and in the words of the president of the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, Ms. Laura Gladding, we are committed not only to preparing our membership to recognize and report suspected instances of human trafficking, but also to raise public awareness of the problem. Flight attendants have thwarted these criminals in the past, but putting an end to human trafficking will require a coordinated and sustained effort, as well as the commitment of the entire transportation industry. Thank you, and I ask that the wallet cards and flash cards be included as part of the report.
Without objection, so ordered. And all of your full statements or any materials you'd like to attach to it will be made a part of the record. Ms. Smolinski?
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, Congress members Weber and Weikart. So nice to see you here today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about preventing human trafficking during major sporting events. Thank you for the very generous introduction as well. I'm Carol Smolinski from ECPAT USA, which is the U.S. branch of an international organization that works in 75 countries to protect children from sexual exploitation. I'll only be summarizing my comments today, and I do have extended comments that I would like to enter into the record. And especially because we are international, I do have some comments about the international aspects of the issue that I probably won't have time to tell you about today. I'm also grateful to you for that really quite thorough overview of estimates about the size and scope of the problem, which I was going to say something about, but which I can skip now. I just want to say that when we're asked questions about statistics, what I do say that we are sure about is that children are bought and sold in the commercial sex trade in the United States. These are children who are brought in from other countries and also American children, sometimes very young children. Adolescents from age 12 to 17 are integrated into the adult commercial sex market. They're not in a separate market. Anybody patronizing the sex market may very well be a child sex exploiter. Best estimates are that at least 100,000 American children are involved. I know you talked about that. It's important to remember, though, that this includes both girls and boys. And because this is a market in human bodies with a supply side and a demand side, we focus our advocacy on major events when the demand side becomes more concentrated in one geographic location for a short period of time before then dispersing again. So that's why we put so much focus on these sporting events. There are extensive prevention, training, awareness raising, and other activities for the Super Bowl taking place in New Jersey. I'm very pleased that we've been able to be part of the multi-stakeholder groups working on this since February in New Jersey. And I know you talked about some of this already, the New Jersey Anti-Trafficking Coalition, the Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investing, and also the New Jersey Attorney General's Office have all been very hard at work for the last several months, specifically on preparing for Super Bowl. As part of this hardworking and creative team, I'm pleased to report our specific projects in New Jersey. With the use of online classified ads, as we know, child trafficking has moved off the streets. Traffickers rent rooms in hotels, go online to create an ad in adult sexual services pages, and sell victims right out of a hotel, or have victims meet purchasers at nearby hotels. Buyers prefer hotel rooms because they believe they are anonymous there, giving them a sense that there's little risk in their behavior. In a study by John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Center for Court Innovation in New York City in 2008, researchers found that 45% of surveyed exploited youth were exploited in hotels in New York. So, ECPAD promotes the Tourism Child Protection Code of Conduct, 6 steps that companies can take to protect children from sexual exploitation. More than 20 U.S. companies and associations have signed the Code of Conduct, including Delta Airlines, of course. Nick's Meeting Management, which is actually mentioned by Congressmember Wagner before, is also a member of the Code. And we've recently had a groundswell of requests for information about the Code from companies in Seattle, which we've been handling, and just recently a company in Seattle signed the Code. The advantage of the Code is that it calls for companies to use their resources to train staff and raise awareness about child trafficking. We couldn't get this done on our own. We require the partnership of these committed partners putting all of their strength to meeting our goals. And in fact, everyone in this room has the power to decide what companies to patronize, and you can use your patronization of companies to indicate which companies that you appreciate when companies do training and awareness raising. We focused our attention in New Jersey on the hotel sector. In November, we co-sponsored a training session with the New Jersey Hotel and Lodging Association, where we gave a presentation on hospitality's role in identifying and reacting to child sex trafficking. Later that month, we were invited by the New York City Hotel and Lodging Association Security Committee to train security representatives of major hotels and local law enforcement on that same topic, attended by about 40 law enforcement and industry personnel. On January 10th, we were invited by Jersey City to give that presentation, and 100% of Jersey City's hotels were in attendance, around 25 people. Great. Our industry partners have been active as well. Carlson Residor, a member of the Tourism Child Protection Code of Conduct, has a policy of contacting hotels and cities prior to major events and asking properties to ensure responsible business training is up to date or to offer a refresher of their child protection training module. Hilton Worldwide, also a member of the code, reported that they completed training of hotels in New Jersey and New York in December and have done follow-up in January. They trained over 250 team members that then cascaded down to their teams. Some non-code companies are also stepping up. Like Carlson, Starwood Hotels and Resorts contacts hotels and cities prior to major events to provide them with the company's human trafficking awareness training. ECPAT USA provided subject matter comments and suggestions for Starwood's e-learning module, which was piloted in December and January in New York and New Jersey, again in preparation for the Super Bowl. As for awareness raising, ECPAT is a co-sponsor of the UN Gift Box project, now installed near Union Square in New York to raise awareness about human trafficking. It's a walk-in piece of street art that looks on the outside like a giant gift wrapped box, and then you learn inside about stories about human trafficking, and I'm grateful to Holly Smith, in fact, for being willing to contribute her story to that gift box that's now open for the public to learn about trafficking. And finally, we've been working with the New York City Port Authority to bring the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign awareness-raising posters to the New York, New Jersey area. Just recently, the Port Authority bus terminal installed 25 of the Blue Campaign posters, and we're hopefully working with DHS that by the end of the week, the New York area airports will also have posters in the airports as well. I have, in my extended remarks, I have information from a conference last year that reviewed anti-trafficking preparation for the 2 previous World Cups in 2006 and 2010, as well as what Brazil is doing in preparation for the upcoming events in Brazil. Let me just conclude by saying that we've been doing this for 23 years, and we've seen enormous changes for the better in our society. Not less due to Congressman Smith's leadership on this, no question about it. We now have a society willing to acknowledge that child sex trafficking exists. Our legislators' commitment to pass legislation to combat it, our criminal justice system's ability to identify exploited children, our child welfare system's ability to help them, and the private sector's acceptance of their role in protecting children. This is fantastic progress that we have made. We still have more to do. And I consider the major sporting events like the Super Bowl to be an opportunity for us advocates to further move the ball down the field to our goal, a world in which all children are free from commercial sexual exploitation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Smolensky. And we do plan on a series of follow-up hearings. Brazil will be one of those, so we do hope that you'll come back. And as we often do, we'll reach out to the ambassador and others to further the cooperation between our own government, particularly the legislative side. So thank you for, and I did read your comments, they were excellent. I'd like to now recognize, for such time as she may consume, Letty Ashworth from Delta.
Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting us to talk about Delta's efforts to combat the scourge of human trafficking and child exploitation. Our CEO, Mr. Richard Anderson, says it best. Delta's core values, along with the responsibility that comes with our global reach, have led us to be at the forefront among airlines in this fight against human trafficking. Human trafficking presents a serious and ongoing threat. Training Delta employees to spot the indicators of human trafficking, enhancing passenger awareness, and coordinating with law enforcement are essential tools to fight it. This year, thousands of people will make the trip to New York City for Super Bowl 48. As New York's largest air carrier and official airline of the Seahawks, Delta will fly the Seahawks and many thousands of fans from dozens of points of our global network to the game. Our customer-facing employees have received training, are in prime position to be eyes and ears to spot potential cases of human trafficking and point them out to law enforcement. All of us at Delta take seriously the responsibility to do what we can to stop trafficking. To that end, Delta has established a formal policy against human rights abuse that condemns human and child trafficking. Employees who participate in human trafficking or child sexual exploitation will be subject to termination. Beyond setting the right expectations for our employees, Delta works actively to help highlight and combat human trafficking. In 2011, Delta became the first U.S. carrier to sign the End Child Prostitution, Pornography, and Trafficking, ECPAC, International Code of Conduct for Tourism. As part of Delta's partnership with ECPAC and implementation of the code, Delta has established an ethical policy regarding commercial sexual exploitation of children, implemented company-wide training requiring employees to report any suspected incidents of trafficking to their managers or law enforcement, introduced a supplier contract clause stating a common repudiation of child commercial sexual exploitation, committed to raising awareness about human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children, provided information to key persons in key locations who informally support the code, and reported annually on our anti-trafficking and child exploitation awareness efforts. Delta has undertaken a number of efforts to highlight the problem of human trafficking. We participated in Human Trafficking Awareness Day in January 2012, invited a victim advocate to address employees, and regularly update employees and shareholders through our internal news publications and in shareholder meetings. In 2012, Delta became one of 12 founding companies of the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And in June of 2013, Delta became one of the first airlines to adopt the DHS Blue Lightning initiative. Blue Lightning provides airline employees with tools to identify and report suspected instances of human trafficking. All customer-facing Delta employees were scheduled to have completed the training by the end of 2013. Delta also participates in events where businesses, governments, and nonprofits connect to address the issue, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, McKenna Long and Aldridge's Women's Initiative, and the Delta-hosted January 10th One Step Forward Summit. Delta is also involved with the Transportation Leaders Against Human Trafficking, championed by the former Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood. Individuals at Delta and our extended Delta family feel passionately about the issue and are personally engaged. A wonderful example is Anna Bastian, who has joined us here today. Mrs. Bastian is the wife of Delta's President Ed Bastian, and she is extensively involved in the Polaris Project, dedicated to fighting trafficking and providing vital services to victims. Anna's leadership on this issue helps set the tone and encourages others at Delta to get involved. Again, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, we are honored to join you here today. We hope that this encourages others in transportation to take what steps they need, they can and should, to stop human trafficking and child exploitation. I would be glad to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Ms. Ashworth, thank you very much for your testimony, and I think I could say without any fear of contradiction that Delta is a quintessential example of corporate responsibility with a commitment to protect the most vulnerable, and we, the committee, is so grateful for your leadership, as well as Anna's. I'd like to now go to Ms. Smith.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith and members of the committee. My name is Holly Smith, and I am a survivor of child sex trafficking within the United States. In 1992, at age 14, I was a shy, insecure, and angry teenager. I had just graduated 8th grade middle school, and I was afraid of starting high school. I was afraid of getting beat up. I was afraid of never being pretty or cool enough to get a boyfriend. And I was afraid of losing my friends. I was also very depressed and in need of real help and guidance. I grew up in rural South Jersey, and my friends and I often hung out at the local mall. It was at this mall that I met a man who picked me out of the crowd and asked for my phone number. I felt special that he picked me, and he told me that I was special when we talked on the phone. He said I was too mature for high school, that I was pretty enough to be a model. He said he could introduce me to famous bands and that I could become a songwriter. As a kid who grew up on MTV, this was my dream. After we talked on the phone for about 2 weeks, this man convinced me to run away from home with him. Within hours of running away, I was forced into prostitution on the streets and in the casino hotels and motels of Atlantic City, New Jersey. 36 hours later, I was arrested by police and treated like a criminal. Without appropriate aftercare services, I struggled for many years to overcome my victimization. As a young adult, I managed to put the past behind me, and I graduated college with a 3.6 GPA in biology and a minor in writing. I had been working as a microbiology analyst for nearly 10 years when I happened to watch a documentary on sex trafficking in India. It wasn't until then that I realized that what had happened to me as a child happens to women and children across the globe. Today, I advocate against all forms of commercial sexual exploitation of children and all forms of human trafficking against any person. I recently wrote an academic book on child sex trafficking in the United States called Walking Prey. And through my research, I discovered many inconsistencies in much of what I was seeing and hearing in the media. I believe the biggest lesson to learn from past Super Bowl preparations is the importance of credibility and longevity in prevention and aftercare efforts. In a blog post last week, Rachel Lloyd, founder and CEO of Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, explained that shaky and overblown statements and statistics can and has caused damage to the credibility of the anti-trafficking movement. We want people to get engaged in this work and the movement for the long haul, explained Lloyd. However, people are often so put off by the hyperbole and sensationalized statistics that soon after the sporting event has passed, many are left in a state of disillusionment and cynicism toward the movement. This kind of awareness and prevention is counteractive. Statistics and claims must be studied and verified, and prevention efforts cannot begin and end with sporting events. In January 1992, the year I was trafficked, the Washington Redskins and the Buffalo Bills competed at the Super Bowl in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Had there been an anti-trafficking awareness campaign in Minneapolis, could the explosion of media attention reached me on the East Coast? Could I have been warned? Maybe. I guess we'll never know. But what I do know is this. There were significant awareness campaigns around the Super Bowl events in 2010, 2011, and 2012. Yet, after I had presented my story in 2013, to the very middle school from which I graduated in 1992, a girl raised her hand and asked me, "Why am I just now hearing about this?" I posed this question to the committee. Why had a 14-year-old girl in a group of at-risk youth never heard of child sex trafficking? It's because our nationwide efforts on child sex trafficking prevention are misplaced and lacking. The Department of Education needs to create and include programs for the education and prevention of child exploitation. Such programs should address media literacy, healthy relationships, healthy role models, mental health awareness, coping skills, volunteer projects, education about social issues in the community and abroad, including human trafficking, and education about community services. Commercial sexual exploitation of children and sex trafficking of any person can happen at many types of sporting events, from Bike Week in Myrtle Beach, North Carolina, to hunting season in South Dakota. However, there are many other risk factors in many communities in the United States that can raise the demand for commercial sex, thereby increasing the risk of commercial sexual exploitation of children and sex trafficking. These include, but are not limited to, the presence of a commercial sex industry, tourist and business attractions, proximity to military bases or other locations with transient populations of men, a high transit area, a subculture of homeless youth, a presence of gangs, and a proximity to national borders. Education and awareness campaigns about commercial sexual exploitation of children and sex trafficking of any person must be developed and maintained in all such communities in order to help prevent this type of exploitation. In addition, there must be outreach efforts to connect with potential victims and offer long-term aftercare services. Furthermore, programs must be created and maintained to address those factors that might predispose adults and children to being vulnerable to commercial sexual exploitation, including sex trafficking. In my book, Walking Prey, I list many predisposing factors to keep in mind for prevention programs specific to the commercial sexual exploitation of children, including school bullying and poverty, and everything in between. The same applies to other forms of child exploitation and human trafficking. Awareness, prevention, and aftercare programs must address all risk factors and root issues. If we are to continue the campaign against sex trafficking at sporting events, then we must use the opportunity to bring to every city both accurate information and resources for long-term awareness, education, and aftercare. This is because, as Rachel Lloyd points out, commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking will undoubtedly happen in the New York, New Jersey area during the first week of February with Super Bowl 48, and the second and third and fourth week of February, and in March and April, and every single day and every night throughout the year. This applies to any community in the world that may be vulnerable to any form of exploitation. Thank you for providing me this opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so very much for your courage, your willingness to help others by talking about the ordeal you have gone through. I do have a question. Did the Atlantic City Police recognize you as a trafficking victim, or were they just tone deaf?
I was recognized as a victim later in the investigation, and all the traffickers in my case were arrested. But because of the way that I was treated initially, it affected the way I responded to law enforcement throughout the case.
How long in that process? When did they finally realize it was trafficking? I mean, was it the first few days?
They never used the word, they never used the word trafficking, but I think that they recognized that I was a victim, but they didn't know just how to treat me. They sort of treated me like an adult, and they treated me like I got myself into a bad situation. It was never explained to me that I was exploited or manipulated.
Did female police officers handle your case, or men?
Men.
How old were you?
I was 14.
And no special provision was provided to you?
Nothing whatsoever. As far as services afterwards, I was sent home, and it was really traumatic. I should have never been sent home that way.
Could you tell us who or what helped you get through this ordeal? Was it faith? Was it somebody, a shelter, or someone who helped you?
It was my school teachers. It honestly, my school teachers played a very big role in keeping me on somewhat of a straight path enough, and they're the ones who really encouraged me to stay in school and to go to college. That's why it's very important to me that advocacy and awareness and prevention and training get into schools, because I really believe teachers want to be a part of the solution. They just need the tools.
Now, the traffickers who were convicted, how many other young women and young girls did they exploit?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I was removed from the case very quickly because my parents just didn't know how to deal with it, and nobody really knew what to do with me or how to deal with it. So as soon as they got my testimony, I really was never involved again until I drove to Atlantic City and retrieved my case files just a few years ago.
Thank you. Let me just ask you a couple of other, ask Nancy Rivard, if you could. You have been doing flight attendant training for years. You recall that both you and Deborah Sigmund spoke at that conference that we had in 2010. Matter of fact, Deborah testified before a commission of Congress in 2010. That was 3 years ago. It seems as if we're making progress, but with the exception of airlines like Delta, the others have not climbed aboard to really make a difference here. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can further get the other airlines to step up to the plate. I mean, I think Delta provides a shining example of what can be done when there's commitment.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And just to tell you, recently, a Delta flight attendant that's one of our members has put together a list of 64 activist flight attendants that want to take our Train the Trainer program and help spread the word around the country. She'll be coming to the training that Deborah and I are doing together, Airline Ambassadors and Innocents at Risk in Phoenix, February 10th. I think that the committee, if you can help us by reaching out to the airlines to follow the example of Delta and expand upon it with the importance of emphasis in classroom training. Frontier, I found out this month, trafficked 3 children into Denver. And as a result, they acknowledged that this had happened on their aircraft. And they're now anxious, according to a phone call yesterday, to jump on board, train their employees. They've invited us to provide a Train the Trainer to their staff, and also open a training to all the airlines in the Denver area. We're very excited about this kind of opportunity, and again, getting the word out with hands-on classroom training to people and flight attendants, flight crew, and all airline employees.
How effective have you been with the international airlines? I sometimes feel like I'm your and Deborah's pamphleteer. Everywhere I go, I met with the foreign minister, for example, of Ethiopia recently, and Ethiopian Airlines certainly is a major conduit of exploited women, especially into the Middle East, as well as elsewhere. I recently spoke with the president not Brazil, well, spoke to a couple presidents, but forever disseminating this information in Peru, and gave him the information, and he showed a great interest as well. And yet, we call back, we try to find out, well, what's being done, and we find out, well, they're looking at it. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of how we can get this off the concept stage
Exactly.
to the true implementation stage.
Well, I feel that the training that we gave together in Kiev, Ukraine in June was actually the first formal training I know of the airline industry in Europe. And as a follow-up to that, we attended the Interpol conference on human trafficking in November and received huge interest from countries around Europe. As a follow-up, we're going to Canada. The ambassador of Hungary has asked us for a training, and also Ireland. The Ireland Immigrant Council is now focusing on airlines. So the problem is, in the United States, we have the DHS tip line. In other countries, we're suggesting now that they follow the protocol we developed with Ukraine to call the Customs Border Protection, national airlines call the Customs Border Protection number in their area until Interpol is strengthened to act similar to DHS for all of Europe. But I'm excited to see the movement. Again, we have 3 or 4 countries internationally requesting our services and realizing that this one action, this one implementation can affect millions, will impact millions of eyes and potentially stop thousands and thousands of trafficking cases.
Thank you. Ms. Ashworth, what has been the feedback from the 80,000 employees on identifying trafficking? Has it been a mind opener for them? Are they enthusiastic about it? And your code of conduct, how has that been received by some of the vendors from which you buy goods from?
Well, it was said earlier, I think the enthusiasm of our employees have been shown by the number who have actually taken the training since September 9th. As of September 9th, through our numbers last week, we have trained somewhere between 58 to 60,000 of our 80,000 employees. Likewise, with our vendors, they too are on board as part of our policy, and we've only received positive feedback.
Since you do so much abroad, so many of your flights obviously are international, do you find some of the other carriers showing an interest where they might want to say, let's do what Delta has done?
Absolutely. It's ongoing dialogue, and we are working with them daily. We are hosting events, as I mentioned, the January 10th summit at Delta Airlines, and we'll continue to do so throughout the year.
Ms. Smolenski, I was very happy to see you say that you're encouraged. We don't hear that all that often. But you also point in your testimony that hotel rooms are the preferred venue for the sale of children because exploiters believe they are anonymous at hotels, giving them a sense that there is little risk in their behavior. Is any of that changing? I know that you have personally in your organization have, continually trained hotel individuals to spot trafficking at the front desk, by the concierge, everyone else in between. And I'm wondering is there true buying there? Are they really getting it?
Absolutely. First of all, let me just respond to your comment about me being encouraged, because in fact, when you do this for a really long time, you see real change taking place. So it takes several years. It's not like we're going to have a big change by next year. Maybe we will. But when you've done it for a long time, it's really night and day. Not that we still don't have big problems of children being trafficked, it's really true. But from when I started in 1991 to today, there's huge changes for the better. I'm always also extremely encouraged when companies take the training. I guess I can't tell you specific cases because I would need to check with a company about telling an anecdote about what they learned, but without fail, every company that that has signed the Code of Conduct and has gone through training, there have been people who said, oh yeah, I saw something like that, I didn't know what to do then, now I know what to do. Or even specific cases of kids who've been identified in New York City in particular. So there's no, it doesn't take that much for people, because the people have an instinct. They see something wrong, they know something's a little wrong with this situation, but unless their company has a policy and has trained them that, yes, they are supposed to do something, they are supposed to tell their supervisor that there's something they're supposed to do, too frequently they had looked away. And now, when companies train, have a policy like Delta, now they know that they're not supposed to look away and they are supposed to do something. And the response we're getting is that employees are gratified by that. It made them feel uncomfortable when they didn't know what to do, and it was, there's something wrong, but they had to look away because they didn't want to get in trouble with their employer. So it's all, I think that companies, and we've heard this over and over again, their employees are very, very happy about it.
And finally, Chief Hansen, if you could, Chairman Riker talked earlier about the annual training, and I think he called it retread training. And I'm wondering if that's what's contemplated at Amtrak. And secondly, could you provide some examples of success stories that you might have so far post-training?
So prior to our partnership with DOT and DHS, our members would have received training in the jurisdictions in which they're commissioned. So that's where they went through the retread. So I think for us to have the opportunity to launch the DHS training was really a huge opportunity. And in fact, in preparation for the Super Bowl, what we did was require our 500 members to go through that training again, which I just did this morning, and then also took the DHS awareness training. So we're looking forward. We're in conversations now with DHS to do the next version of that for Amtrak Police, and then with our own employees, particularly our onboard service. Here in the Northeast Corridor, the conductor and the onboard service crew is pretty busy there because it's pretty fast moving. Those trains stop, they got to get your ticket. But you get out of the Northeast Corridor, you get on a long haul, you go from here to New Orleans or from Portland to Oakland, there's more of an opportunity for a crew to really put eyeballs on people. So there we do have a training opportunity here in 2014 with our onboard staff, and our police officers will be giving some training actually on active shooter, and then we intend once again to do a refresh on the indicators and the awareness for human trafficking. Interestingly enough, just in October, we had a case where a gal went to the bathroom and called 911 and had been in this Northeast Corridor from New Jersey, and in this case had been in Laurel, Maryland. They were in Union Station where they had come down here. She was in an abusive relationship and was forced into prostitution, and working with the Metropolitan Police's special squad that does sex trafficking, we were able to arrest the subject who was abusing and pimping this woman. And then, of course, the Metropolitan Police have strong relationships with NGOs to supply support once those cases are made. And that case actually is coming up to court in 2 weeks.
Mr. Meadows?
Thank each of you for being here, truly for your testimony. But more importantly than that, I think I want to thank you for taking this on when it is not something that is talked about. It is not something that many times is applauded. It's something that many times we have a difficult time grasping and understanding, whether it be with victims or whether it's how to really look at it. So I just want to say thank you for your work. I do want to follow up a little bit with, and it gets, my colleague here to my right has mentioned about the training. You only really emphasize those things that you continue to train. Many of you are involved in training aspects way beyond just the human trafficking aspect of that. And if you don't continue to train and continue to put an emphasis on it, it falls by the wayside. So how can we highlight, I think, Ms. Rivard, you said there's 64 people that are taking this on personally, is that correct?
Yeah, that's coming out of Delta. They're the flight attendants that want more training that have asked us to provide it. And so they have asked us to be, we're looking to train a pool of flight attendants that can go out and make this real for other airlines and other colleagues in the field.
And so can we as members of Congress encourage them, whether it be letters, phone calls, you know, if you'll get us that list, I'm sure I can work with Chairman Smith to make sure that those 64 people, you know, right now they're just a number.
Right.
I'd like to make sure that we thank them individually for their efforts and to encourage it. I sit on the Aviation Subcommittee.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And this is the first time that I'm really hearing all of this, and so I'm on transportation, and so I plan to take it back to my committee to make sure that we start to highlight this, whether it is on the Aviation Subcommittee or on rail or wherever it may be. Secretary Fox is a father. And I plan, as I leave here, to call the secretary and let him know about this, because I think if we redouble our efforts, what we will start to see is that we will make a difference. And so the optimism that has been shared here today, I want you to know that your efforts, I applaud your efforts, each one of you. I applaud your bold stand and willing to not only come, but congratulations on a 3.6 GPA. I mean, well done. And I'm just thankful for those teachers who invested in you, who saw, who would have never have known that you would have been here on Capitol Hill testifying before Congress on something that is so intimate but so vitally important. So I'll submit a few questions for the records. I just want to say thank you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Beddoes. Chairman Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, you know, I forgot who mentioned this, but I think that who mentioned Seahawks coming to, yeah, well, if I could say go Seahawks. And, I think there's an opportunity here to work with the NFL. I'm imagining that you've all thought of that already. And I know that Coach Carroll is engaged in an effort in Seattle he calls A Brighter Seattle, and working with young people on the streets of Seattle, which I think is, you know, it certainly sounds to me like it would fit into, you know, what we've been talking about today. So I think the NFL would be a great partner with the airlines. They fly a lot, obviously. And I was in the airport yesterday when they left on Delta. I almost wanted to get on their plane, but I wanted to also touch on the training thing real quick. I'm not sure that academies do this today, but it might be a great opportunity to sort of look at having someone like Ms. Smith, if they have the courage like she does to go and share her story with the first line law enforcement officers and the detectives and those personnel who are dealing with young people on the streets. Maybe as before they get the badge and the, you know, and the swearing-in ceremony occurs, it might be a good idea for him to hear from someone who's been there on the streets, survived, and really can hear how serious a problem this is, how traumatic it is. And I think you recognize from my earlier comments that this really touches me because I've seen a lot of tragedy. So I really want to commend Ms. Smith. I never did get a 3.6, so you're doing something right. And look, I end up here in Congress. I was lucky to get a 2.9, I think was probably the highest I got. But I wanted to really emphasize what you said about teachers, because I mentioned that earlier in my comments too. It was my geometry teacher, football coach, that kept me from going further down the road to where I know I shouldn't have been going. And I too want to just, you know, your teachers, commend your teachers and you for listening to them, because sometimes teachers aren't listened to always. And then I just wanted to say that one of the things we need to do, all of us in this room are here to work on this problem and eliminate it. That's the goal. Not reduce the numbers, but eliminate it. And there's a team here if I can call you Molly for a second, Molly, there's a team here with you now of people. We want to help. And you mentioned prevention, education, aftercare, advocacy, awareness, and all those things. But I think we need to really listen to your testimony, act on your testimony. My question for you is, what do you think is the most needed service that would best help those victims and survivors of sex trafficking?
I think that prevention is really lacking. When I talk to young girls, they haven't heard about sex trafficking, but even before a child reaches the point of being vulnerable to trafficking, I think that many of these girls are first vulnerable to sexual exploitation in itself, just being sexually exploited by somebody. And so I think there needs to be a stronger prevention program for at-risk youth that includes just a number of programs that can prevent sexual exploitation. And that would include media literacy and understanding for the messages that like kids are surrounded by media messages. And oftentimes these media messages are of sexualized women, objectified women. We kind of live in this culture that normalizes this sexual objectification and exploitation of women. And so I think that it needs to begin in schools, a deconstruction of media messages, not just to empower girls from being victimized, but to educate boys that it's not okay to look at girls that way.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all again for all you do, and thank you so much, Ms. Smith, for being here. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I want to thank our 5 very distinguished and very effective women for testifying today, for your work on behalf of those who are commodified and exploited. You have made a huge difference, will continue to do so. And I do think that the 5 of you are trafficking victims' best friends, and conversely, traffickers' worst enemy. The hearing's adjourned. Just for the record, I do have to make a, you got this? Yeah, I'm just gonna say. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements and questions for the record. That includes a statement by Committee Chairman Ed Royce, which is submitted for the record. And American Airlines will also submit a statement, and we may get some statements from a few other airlines. The hearing's adjourned.